Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Survivors Tell of Fight in Sea. Peril not known to passengers until long after Titanic struck. The subheadline is Women sent off first. Men in small boats try to sing to drown out cries of the perishing. Heartrending scenes attending disaster are dramatically described. This story originally came from New York on April 19th. It says, the stories of the survivors of the Titanic are all practically agreed on one thing, that the passengers on the liner did not realize their peril until long after the vessel struck. A Mr. Chambers, one of the survivors, had this to say. The Titanic struck the iceberg head on. The passengers ran out, but believing that the ship could not sink, and being assured by the officers, again went back to their staterooms. After about 2 hours, the alarm was sent out, and the passengers started to enter the lifeboats. There was nothing like panic at first, as all believed that there were plenty of lifeboats to go around. After the lifeboat, in which Mr. Chambers was, had gone about 400 yards from the ship, those in it saw the Titanic begin to settle quickly, and there was a rush for the remaining lifeboats. One was swamped. The great ship sank slowly by its head, and no suction was felt by the boat in which Mr. Chambers was. Tell scene at rescue. A passenger aboard the rescue ship Carpathia, Miss Sue Eva Rule, a sister of Judge Virgil Rule of St. Louis, detailed the thrilling scenes which marked the rescue of the survivors of the greatest marine tragedy of the age. Unknown to the sleeping passengers, the ship turned abruptly to the north. None knew of the sudden change of course, and the first intimation anybody got of the fact that anything unusual was about to take place was the order given the steward to prepare breakfast for 3,000. The tidings ran through the ship like wildfire, and long before the Cunarder had come within the scene of the tragedy, we were all on deck. Sight first of boats. Just as day broke, a tiny craft was sighted rowing towards us, and as it came closer, we saw women huddled together, the stronger ones manning the oars. The first to come aboard was a nursemaid, who had wrapped in a coat an 11-month-old baby, the only one of a family of 5 persons to be rescued. The men and women both seemed dazed. Most of them were almost perished with the cold, and some of them who had been literally thrown into the lifeboats perished from exposure. One of the most harrowing scenes I ever saw was the service of Thanksgiving, and followed by the prayers for the dead, which followed the incoming of the little band of survivors, which took place in the dining saloon of the Carpathia. The moans of the women and the cries of little children as their loss was brought home to them were heartrending. The hope that by some means their beloved ones would be saved never left the survivors. Survivors in strange dress. How those who were saved survived the exposure is a miracle. One woman came aboard devoid of underwear, a Turkish towel wrapped about her waist serving as a corset, while a magnificent evening wrap was her only protection. Women in evening frocks and white satin slippers, and children wrapped in steamer rugs were ordinary sights, and very soon the passengers themselves were almost in as bad a plight as the rescued. Trunks were unpacked, and clothing distributed right and left. Finally, the steamer rugs were ripped apart and sewed into impromptu garments. My first view of the first boat sighted led me to think we were picking up the crew of a dirigible. Back of the boat loomed in the shadowy dawn the huge iceberg which had sent the Titanic to the bottom. The lifeboat looked like the usual boat which swings from a balloon. Women discuss scenes. After an hour or so of rest, the only relief the women who had been literally torn from their husbands seemed to have was in discussing the last scenes. Shooting was heard by many in the lifeboats just before the ship took its final plunge and sunk from sight, and the opinion of many was that the men, rather than drown, shot themselves. Mrs. Astor, who was one of the first to come aboard, was taken at once to the captain's room. Others were distributed among the cabins, the Carpathia's passengers sleeping on the floors of the saloons, in the bathrooms, and on the tables throughout the ship, in order to let the survivors of the wreck have as much comfort as the ship afforded. One woman came aboard with a 6-month baby she had never seen, until the moment it was thrust into her arms as she swung into the lifeboat. Nothing could equal the generosity and helpfulness of the Carpathia's passengers. Doubted word at first. Mrs. Lewis Mansfield Ogden of Manhattan described how she felt when she heard the Carpathia's whistle sounding early in the morning. Mrs. Ogden asked her husband if there was a fog. Mr. Ogden had left the stateroom, however, and did not explain until some 10 minutes later. The ship had then slowed down perceptibly, and Mrs. Ogden was pretty nervous. Then her husband returned and told her that there had been a great accident and that the Carpathia was going to help. The passengers are asked to keep to their rooms, he said. There isn't any need of being frightened. There's been no fire on our boat, but there has been an accident to the Titanic. Mrs. Ogden thought that an accident to the Titanic was quite too ridiculous to think of, and in that she shared the impression which, so she learned afterward, was current upon the Titanic after the latter had struck. Mrs. Ogden dressed hastily and went on deck. Boats filled with survivors. I saw there on the bosom of the ocean, she said, a boat full of women and children. I suppose there must have been sailors there too, but I did not see them. There were only 1 or 2 women in evening dress, but most of them were clad in fur coats over their kimonos or nightgowns. They had on their evening slippers and silk stockings. Some of them wore hats. Far in the distance were 2 or 3 other black specks, which we made out also to be boats. As daylight grew, we made out more and more boats, 3 on one side of our ship and 5 on the other. Still later we picked up more. Here and there on the ocean's surface, among the field of ice, were bits of wreckage from the broken Titanic. And there were in sight many bergs, 80 and 90 feet high. The passengers of the Titanic were taken aboard the Carpathia, boatload by boatload, up the sea ladders. Most women hoisted aboard. The women, most of them were hoisted to the decks of the Carpathia in swings, but a few were hardy enough to climb aboard by the sea ladders. The ocean, all this time, was calm as a lake, and it was not a difficult task to take the excess passengers aboard. Some of the women helped out in the rowing in the lifeboats themselves. Jumped into a small boat. Abraham Hyman, a steerage passenger from Manchester, England, won his safety by leaving the steerage and going into the first cabin. I got alongside of a boat, he said, and they lowered it, full of passengers. I just crowded in beside the man at the tiller. They could have taken 15 more people in our boat. There was no commotion in the first cabin. I heard that a man was shot in a panic in the steerage. When our boat got into the water, it drifted under the exhaust of the Titanic, and we were nearly swamped. We rowed off for about half a mile, and then saw the lights on the Titanic sink gradually out of sight. As the boat sank, the lights went down, one after another. Hyman said he heard of one man who had been sitting on a pile of deck chairs when the last explosion came, who was blown off with the deck chairs. The man was found in the ocean on the deck chairs. Boiler blast split vessel. Mrs. E.W. Carter left the Carpathia terribly shaken by her experience. She was met at the pier by Albert B. Ashforth. Mrs. Carter could not talk of the collision and the wreck, but Mr. Ashforth said that what had impressed her was the last boiler explosion. Mrs. Carter said that the shock of the collision was nothing, said Mr. Ashforth, but the last boiler explosion tore the ship to pieces. She was in the last boat off. What impressed Z. Taylor of Philadelphia most was the lack of excitement when the ship struck. He said he was on the deck when the Titanic hit the iceberg, and that he did not see any iceberg, and did not think that anybody else did. Mr. Taylor said that he saw Mr. Ismay get into a boat 15 minutes before the Titanic sank. Then came an officer, said Mr. Taylor, and said, "This boat is for women only," and Mr. Ismay got out without raising any disturbance. This story came from the great state of Iowa, being reported in the Spirit Lake Beacon of April 25th, 1912. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.